See, people are attracted to cities because of opportunity. They're hotbeds for innovation. There's creativity, there's people. But what happens when a city experiences a shock, a Black Saturday bushfire, or a terrorist event, or the loss of a major employer? Will they continue to provide shelter, have their citizens engaged, make good decisions? If they are fragile, and if they're vulnerable cities, then you start seeing the accumulation of stress, and you can see that in the streets as homelessness, aggression, you can see rubbish on the street, derelict sites. So we understand a resilient city as safe and secure with engaged people with smiles on their faces, and the opposite of a resilient city as insecure, unsafe, unwell. So I've been asked to broaden the concept of resilience, and I'm going to tell you two stories from our work with the Department of Health and Human Services in Victoria, really bringing out the human dimensions of resilience. And by that I mean, what is it about the people in the city that makes the city resilient, and then what's the role of the property sector to help build people's resilience and therefore the city's resilience. So the first story I'm going to tell is about the Falls Festival in Lorne. You've got a couple of Falls festivals in New South Wales as well. So it's a big outdoor festival, and the Department of Health and Human Services were worried about climate change in relation to the Falls Festival. It's in Lorne, which is a regional town. On a heat wave day, what happens is you get people getting heat stroke or other heat illnesses, and they show up at the Lorne Regional Hospital. So there's a hot day, they show up at the hospital, and the hospital has to work out who needs the help the most, the fastest. And how do they do that? They talk to Geelong Hospital using teleconference, remote medical sensing. They use technological triage to get people help as quickly as possible. So we have a challenge now, because during a heat wave, it's exactly the time where you're most likely to lose power, where your ICT is going to be stressed, and when your roads are going to be congested or impacted. This is a very vulnerable system. This is potentially not a resilient town. Now, why has it come to this? If you look at the underlying vulnerability of this situation, it's because the GPs have left the region. Doctors are gone from a lot of our rural and regional areas all around Australia for lots of different reasons. So to protect Lorne and the Falls Festival from this kind of event, what can we do? I've got some thoughts about what the property sector can do. Let's begin. First, easy, shelter. So at the Falls Festival, how do we keep vulnerable people, in particular children and older people, people with illness, pregnant women, safe from heat? Shelter's an obvious answer. And then how do you make a hospital safe during these high-pressure situations when anything can trigger people to aggression? We know during a heat wave there's a lot more violence on our beaches, people showing up in the hospital. One of the biggest risks that a hospital faces is aggression to their staff. So what can the property sector do to make hospitals calming places when your child desperately needs help, but there's a big queue of people in front of you? And then the obvious of how do you make the infrastructure more robust to loss of electricity? And then, most interestingly for me, how do you make that regional community a more economically diverse place, a great place, so that we don't lose key workers from our regions? And if you think this conversation is just about the regions, we've got the same conversations been happening with Melbourne Health in the middle of our cities. We've got it all throughout our growth areas. How do we make sure that our hospitals deal with the immediate acute shocks of a big event, like a heat wave or a bushfire, but also the ongoing mental burden that comes from a big event like a bushfire? So my second story is about how we as cities and the society looks after our most vulnerable people, who are young people, migrants, people who don't speak English, people with HIV. The way we look after these people is often through community service organisations. These are not-for-profits, typically, reliant on government funding, reliant on volunteers. So I've got here a picture of a town. The community service organisations have their home base here, and a bushfire comes through, or a flood, or any kind of shock that might knock out an asset. And what we know from research is that in the first week after a big event like that, half of our community service organisations are out of action, just when their help is needed the most, and about 25% never come back. They never come back, and you'll never get that organisation helping in the aftermath or onwards from that event. So what is the role of our sector to help protect the most marginalised in these shocks and stresses? The obvious one, make our built environment resilient to these sorts of events, plan our cities so that they're not as vulnerable to exposure. If any of you are in the room who provide loans or insurance, making sure that these very vulnerable organisations and households have financial resilience to events like this. So that might be giving them the knowledge about what kind of exposure they have as they move in and work in these communities, or giving them a grace period to get back on their feet. The utility sector is excellent at this. Building people's knowledge of what the risks are and how they can prepare. So the property sector has led the way in developing community resilience plans. And don't make those things just tick the box exercises, they really matter. When people are in these situations, they need that plan to know what to do next. And then finally, this is the one which I think is most interesting. The most resilient organisations we found were the ones that were most socially connected to other organisations. As soon as you got one organisation that was by itself, that was isolated, they were the ones most vulnerable to collapse. So a lot of the work we've been doing, we've been coaching organisations throughout Victoria about preparing for shocks and stresses, is actually bringing them together to build networks with each other, so they have that social capital to draw on when they need that help. So what can the property sector to build relationships between organisations and people, shared spaces? A really interesting fact I find is that there's a lot more volunteering in inner city areas as compared to the outer suburbs, not because city dwellers are more altruistic, but it's because they've got more time because they're not stuck in cars commuting. So there's a good planning story told there. So then, what makes a city resilient? Through the City Resilience Index, over 5 years of research, we've worked out the 12 things that matter to make a city resilient, and they fall under these headings: health and wellbeing, about the people in the city, how we organise ourselves to work collaboratively together, economy and society, infrastructure environment, the systems that protect us, and leadership and strategy, so how do we make good decisions? You'll see the City Resilience Index, it takes those 12 goals around in the yellow, and then 52 observable indicators that you can look at in a city and work out how resilient they really are. And these are the kind of indicators we do have, for example, safe access to drinking water, the ability to provide insurance. So in the last two stories, what I've done is talked about a little bit about the property sector's contribution to city resilience. And our intuition is, of course, we can contribute to the infrastructure and ecosystems part of that wheel, which is about reducing exposure, making assets that are resilient. But I've also talked about already our contribution to a diverse and robust sustainable economy and diverse livelihoods. We've talked about our contribution to community identity and cohesion. That's about diverse livelihood and employment, and then empowered stakeholders by equipping them with knowledge. So if we apply our mind, have the opportunity to create value all around that wheel, just as part of core business. And that's what I'd like you to think about. Look at the City Resilience Index, map out how your resilience plan does create for you competitive advantage by solving social problems. my tip to you is if you have one person looking after your business continuity plan or your adaptation plan, it's very likely to be an incomplete view of resilience. So get more people involved in that important work in your organisation.